bit. My project is Emotions, and it's a narrative of my own personal journey of dyslexia, being a dyslexic adult. The project focuses on creating an interactive and accessible experience of consisting of my personal stories with late detection of dyslexia. I would talk about my research questions first. My primary research question was how might I create an interactive and inclusive digital experience of my narrative of being a dyslexic adult with late diagnosis, which is relatable, educational, and accessible. And my secondary research question is how might I create strategies that foster other dyslexic individuals to engage and dialogue with my digital narrative? So, how I can achieve this is something that I'm going to talk about it through my whole journey today. Uh, this is a best meme in my head to comprise of what it feels like to be dyslexic. And why this project? When I got diagnosed a couple of years ago, I felt like it was a great missing puzzle in my life. That it was a huge relief to know that I was, but immediately felt being like lack of support and resources became a pain point for me, and I wanted to eliminate the feeling of less support and feeling lost immediately when I think of this project when I began the whole journey. But that's where I started to like push myself to actually read more and more about dyslexia. When I got diagnosed, I was a bit lost, and I think I took a year or two to like figure out what it feels like to be dyslexic and go through that whole process of accepting myself. But in this project, I did get the time to like push myself to know more about the adulthood aspect of it. So I began to like read a lot of books, podcasts, videos, being parts of community groups, which was amazing as an experience because I started to like discover a lot of things. And naturally I started to like record a lot of my stories, and I was consuming so much content, and I started to draw connections where I'm like, oh, that has happened to me and that has not happened to me, but at a different capacity. So a lot of comparison kind of started to happen, and that's what seemed interesting in a way that I reached a conclusion that I wanted to generate resources of my stories because I learned so much from reading other people's stories. And I started to like add richness by looking at my own story. So I was adding richness to the community by talking about my own journey. And I also realized that self reflection and discoveries are quite important when you're in a spectrum because everybody's journey is different and unique. Moving on to what did I learn from my research? Dyslexia in adulthood was the starting aspect of it. Slowly started to learn a little bit more and more about inclusive design approach, and also like web accessibilities, W3G, and the benchmarks that people were using. And finally, a little bit more and more about interactive documentaries, narratives, and some parts of the information visualization as well. I began with understanding dyslexia in adults and myself, slowly talking about implications of late diagnosis as well, impact on behavior and emotions of an adult and consequences of it, understanding my superpowers as well. I think that's most important in the journey, and understanding the intervention strategies and mapping those. Finally, understanding a little bit more about how it affected the context and environment too, and increasing the circle, I started to understand the current pathological and societal portrayal as well. Now, jumping to the next part of it, the inclusive design approach, I started with the first dimension, the human difference and variability, where I started to understand that how self reflection, like I spoke, is important, and embracing diversity is the greatest asset for us because everybody's different, and uniqueness is essential to everyone. Specifically in my case, I realized that I had a unique experience. I come from a unique background, so I'm expert in my own journey, so that was important so that I can create innovative explorations for myself and additionally helping the community at large. The next dimension was inclusive co-design approach. I was thoroughly co-designing when I started to reflect is when I was the person who was in creating the information and data for myself. And then I was like doing the research behind it. And then I was the designer too. So I was moving between roles constantly to be able to understand how I'm looking at myself at different perspectives. And another aspect that I kind of realized and my secondary kind of pointed out to me was that I was using a hybridized version of my own intervention because I got diagnosed late. I developed my own coping mechanisms to deal with it all these years. So I started to co create my own personal interventions and the existing ones to create an adaptive, effective structure for me. And the third one being designing in a complex adaptive system in flux. What I mean by that is the last slide spoke about the different aspects that I was looking at. So those are the layers that are nested within and influence each other. So my workspace, my education space, the culture, the home, the personal scenarios, struggles, interventions, community, medical approach, all of it started to affect each other because these are different aspects of it which keep moving and keep affecting each other. So being able to acknowledge the adaptiveness was important because it affected how I felt and how I was feeling or perceiving also. And the magical method that I used was autoethnography, which helped me reflect amongst all of these three things and start to think about it in a deeper essence and start to see the influence that I was having through this whole journey. And now that I've started to create this information, how did I record all of that? Uh, I feel mind maps an amazing tool for me. So I was collecting my own stories, speaking to some friends and family about me, and the resources and knowledge about dyslexia and adulthood is important. So being able to mind map, I had like about 30, 40 mind maps in the journey of collecting data for myself and like figuring out and doing all that reflection. I was like, how do I organize all the chaos of the information? So I gravitated towards tables and spreadsheets because they allow a proper format, but yet I could color code them and have that flexibility to play with it because I enjoy being able to see data with color. And that's where it's helped me analyze the data better, see the repetition, and see everything together to be able to make sense of it better and better. Uh, and when I was able to do that, I was able to like do some illustrations as well. Like I was trying to visualize my emotions, visualize all the uh, memory or like the stories that I was recording to give more materialization and context to it for myself. And I think storytelling was happening more at par with illustration because I had started to feel that what kind of narrative structure would I imagine for myself? And I realized that the table and spreadsheets weren't the best way. So I used this software called Twine to explore the overlaps between the stories because I could see that certain emotions were helping me. That I could see there were overlaps between the stories. So that I wanted to figure out what kind of narrative structure is something that I want to use eventually. Once all of this happened, how did I communicate the data collected? But before that, I had to like first define my guidelines before jumping into the design aspect of it, where I would say, okay, I looked at W3G, the benchmarks that they had. I was reading a book by Regina of Inclusive Design for a Digital World, which had a lot of guidelines about the font sizes, the spacing, the line spacing, color contrast, and type of the font, and those kinds of minute details. At the same time, bigger principles too. And I also began to draw a lot of inspiration from studying different interactive documentaries, the narrative structure, media, visualization style, and all of those things. And there are a couple of examples I do talk about it in my thesis document is the Prison Valley, After Storm, Vimy, great illustrations and great visualization and narrative building that those examples did and did help me imagine a lot of it for myself. And another one was Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow project, which showcased a huge chunk of data with emotions. I think that was a great space for inspiration for me because I was also anchoring a lot of it on emotions. And finally, with my background of being a researcher, I had to like get a little order in the chaos as well constantly, that I had to figure out. I used this research method, the design research, where I started to define my goal, increase the understanding of my goal, and then created like design specific guidelines, and with all that research I was conducting, and then do some testing eventually. um, with this, I finally created these 4 design guidelines for my designing process, and I was anchoring on it. And these guidelines were amalgamation of inclusive web accessibility for dyslexics, and a little bit with interactive documentary, because uh, media and visualization helps share information more differently. So these were the four I was using for my designing aspect. Moving ahead, how did I make the digital experience? Used iterative design method where I was brainstorming, creating my designs, and I was auditing if I was complying with the accessibility guidelines, and then doing some self-testing and feedback from my committee, and also like synthesis and finding out of what I was taking away from each cycle, and then going back and forth. So each of the iteration cycles were making me more aware of the usability, purpose, navigation, visualization, and accessibility issues. So that was essential. And that helped me understand a little bit more about my design process. So jumping into the making part, which was amazingly fun, creating the characters. So I know that colors and shapes are great visual points for dyslexic individuals, and it has been for me too. So I started to map my emotions with color and use Paul Ekman's ideology of how he uses emotions, as in with colors, also like how he understands emotion as an important aspect. So I chose to work with 5 emotions: anger, sadness, joy, fear, and disgust. And each emotion had their own distinctive physicalization, expression, gesture, feeling, and all of that. So it began with this blob of character. Then I started to explore with, okay, uh, can I give more movement to it or make it more static, and then give more limbs to it and see what happens. And then finally arriving into the final version of it, where I started to understand, reading more about anime cartoons to see how they can exaggerate emotions and expressions to achieve what they're trying to communicate. So that's what I was trying to do. So these are some of the final ones that they look, the 5 categories that I worked with. Moving on, creating the web experience following the guidelines like I mentioned before was something constant in the process. So I began with the first prototype. The first prototype focused on creating the base structure and flow of the digital experience. Inspired this project. I was inspired by so many projects. So I was focusing on narrative structure, information architecture, engagement, navigation, thematic detailing, and different aspects of it. And once that happened, once the structure was stabilizing a little bit, I was starting to apply accessibility rules like font type, minimal text, readability, audiovisual formats, and prefer less reading as well. So I had added immersive reader, which would allow customization and more possibilities of it. And the second prototype focused, after the feedback that I received, focused on the introduction, the homepage, the interaction, how to keep the intrigue in the audience, constantly developing and testing features as well, and different use cases that I was imagining. And the third and fourth prototype was more around refinement and detailing, giving more control to the audience, adding more buttons, better navigation, ensuring seamlessness in the journey, ensuring familiarity in design, because that's very important, establishing a space for everything in the design, and doing audio visual, doing contrast check, adding a timeline that kind of helped me explain the journey better, adding uniformity in design through icons, forms, and locations. In this icon, I had to change the environment one because it looked different from all. So adding that level of detailing was something that I was focusing on in these versions of the cycles. And then finally created the mobile version as well, because to add more reachability and accessibility, because mobile are mini computers now. So kept the visual language same totally, but the navigation for mobiles are different because they're more touch based and the gestures are different. So decluttered the content, reduced the visual disruptions. I started to like explore how touch and click would work and what the transition would look like different in different screens. How can we increase usability and cohesion, and also like testing the size of it because now the size of the screen is different. So text size, clickability of icons, and everything was constantly being tested on this smaller screen too, and readability as well. Eventually, I did some testing with about 5, 6 participants with a mix of neurodiverse and neurotypical folks in the testing so that I ensure that the experience is comfortable for everyone. Great learnings were great representation of characters, they were enjoyable. Audio visuals were related for in for uh, you okay uh, for the neurodiverse people and support and library buttons. People did see value in it because it was adding more essence to the stories, and neurotypical people were finding it intriguing to see the depth of emotion as well. There were some issues that were highlighted was that the mobile format had some navigational issues that it missed out nudging, and somebody did mention that the website version would be nice to have like a tutorial as well. Finally, building and coding was crazy. I had a person who helped me program, a programmer. I'm not good at it at all. So a lot of back and forth happened without compromising on the experience, but a lot of negotiation happened in the process, and a lot of design decisions and changes happened with the technical capabilities. So that was another frustrating process, but it was interesting. And finally, hoping that you've seen my documentation for the exhibition, I would talk about the responses. I did have a takeaway section where I discovered that people enjoy the look and feel of it, the interactivity, the storytelling and detailing. Some of them could feel relatability and connections with themselves. And some people mentioned that empathy for dyslexics is something that they could see, and how that the struggles are more daily life, and deep reflection were valuable. Somebody gave me kudos for being vulnerable and expressing and talking about my stories. Somebody mentioned about phone being a medium of storytelling was interesting for them. Documentation and storytelling and reflections are important and was appreciated. And somebody mentioned feeling less alone was a great feeling for them. I think that's the best takeaway that I have, and that's what I was trying to eliminate. So with this, I would end my presentation and happy to put it out for the forum.